Isaiah's unseen hand, God's prophecies shaping history. More than 2,700 years ago, a man wrote words that should not exist, not predictions that could be guessed, not poetic hopes, but names, dates, outcomes, carved into history before history happened. Empires rose because he said they would. Kings fell because his words named them. A city was destroyed, stone by stone, exactly as written. And here's the unsettling part. These weren't written after the fact. They were sealed, preserved, translated, copied, long before the events occurred. So that leaves us with a question no one likes to ask. What if history isn't random? What if wars, rulers, and revolutions were never truly in control? What if an unseen hand has been turning the pages all along? Tonight, we don't begin with faith. We begin with evidence, with records, with a prophet named Isaiah, and a trail of fulfilled prophecy that still shakes historians, theologians, and skeptics to this day. And once you see what he wrote, you'll never look at world events the same way again. Pause, because what comes next might explain why you're alive right now. Long before skyscrapers pierced the sky, long before nations drew borders on maps, long before the world learned to record its own memory, one man stood in the shadows of Jerusalem and wrote words that history would spend the next 2,000 years trying to explain. His name was Isaiah, not a king, not a general, not a man with armies or political power, just a prophet. And yet, what Isaiah wrote would outlast empires, outlive civilizations, and quietly govern the rise and fall of history itself. Here's the thing. Isaiah wasn't writing poetry meant to inspire. He wasn't offering vague spiritual comfort. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was naming the future. And not in metaphors, not in symbols that could be bent later, but in details so precise that centuries later, scholars would hesitate to read them out loud. Because once you read them carefully, you're forced into an uncomfortable corner. Either Isaiah somehow saw forward through time, or history has been obeying a script it didn't know it was following. Stay with me, because Isaiah lived in a world that did not look powerful. Jerusalem was small, vulnerable, surrounded by enemies stronger, richer, and more advanced. The Assyrian Empire loomed like a shadow ready to swallow everything in its path. Kings trembled. Cities vanished overnight. And the people of Judah lived with the constant fear that tomorrow might be their last. That's when Isaiah began to speak. And what he said didn't sound safe. He spoke of destruction before anyone could imagine it. He spoke of exile while the temple still stood. He spoke of foreign kings who had not yet been born, calling them by name. And the people heard him the way people always hear uncomfortable truth. They ignored him. Think about that. A man stands in your city and says, "Everything you trust will fall. Your walls won't save you. Your leaders won't protect you. And God is already writing what comes next." No one wants to hear that. So Isaiah kept writing, scroll after scroll, vision after vision, Prophecies sealed away, copied, preserved. Not because people believed them, but because they feared them. And here's where the story begins to tighten. Because Isaiah didn't just speak to his own generation. He spoke to kings who wouldn't exist for another 150 years. He spoke to cities that hadn't yet fallen. He spoke to events so specific that modern historians would later admit, quietly, that something here doesn't fit normal explanations. Let me show you what I mean. Isaiah described a future moment when Jerusalem would fall, not to the Assyrians everyone feared, but to a different empire altogether, an empire not yet on the world stage, an empire no one was watching. Babylon. At the time Isaiah wrote this, Babylon was weak, almost irrelevant, a footnote compared to Assyria. And yet Isaiah spoke as if Babylon's victory was already history. He described the exile of God's people. He described the looting of the temple. He described chains, marches, and a foreign land by strange rivers. And here's the unsettling part. Isaiah didn't stop there. He spoke of the exile ending, not vaguely, not someday, but by the hand of a specific ruler. A ruler Isaiah named before the ruler's parents had even met, before the empire existed, before history had any reason to prepare for it. Isaiah wrote the name Cyrus. Pause. Let that sit, because this is where the ground begins to shift. Cyrus would not be born for another century and a half. Yet Isaiah didn't describe him as a possibility. He spoke of him as an instrument, a chosen agent, a foreign king who would unknowingly fulfill the will of God. Isaiah said Cyrus would conquer Babylon. He said Cyrus would issue a decree. And he said that decree would allow the Jewish exiles to return home and rebuild Jerusalem. This wasn't symbolic. It was logistical, political, documentable. And centuries later, it happened. But I don't want to rush past this. Because the real shock isn't that Isaiah was right. The real shock is how right he was. Babylon fell in a way no one predicted. Its gates left open, its river diverted, its defenses bypassed without a battle. Just as Isaiah described. Cyrus entered the city almost peacefully. And then something extraordinary occurred. Cyrus issued an official proclamation allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem. That decree still exists in ancient records. Not in the Bible, in Persian history. And suddenly, Isaiah's words were no longer religious claims. They were historical artifacts. And that should disturb us. Because if Isaiah could see that far, if he could name a king before his birth, if he could describe an empire's fall before its rise, then the question stops being, was Isaiah inspired? And becomes something much harder to avoid. What else did he see? And more importantly, why are we still living inside the consequences of his words? Because Isaiah didn't just write about kings and cities. He wrote about suffering, about a servant, about wounds, about redemption purchased at a cost no one expected. And he wrote it with the same unsettling precision. Stay with me. Because what Isaiah saw next reaches straight into our time. And once you hear it, history will stop feeling random. Isaiah's vision doesn't jump randomly through time. It moves like a current, quiet at first, then impossible to resist. After naming kings and toppling empires with ink and breath, Isaiah turns his attention inward, toward something more unsettling than war. Because conquering nations is impressive, predicting rulers before they exist is disturbing. But what Isaiah describes next is personal, painful, and it refuses to stay in the past. Isaiah begins to speak of a figure he calls a servant, not a king, not a conqueror, not a man crowned in gold, a servant. And the way Isaiah describes him doesn't sound like victory at all. He speaks of rejection, of misunderstanding, of a man so ordinary that people would turn their faces away. Isaiah says this servant would be despised. He would carry sorrow. He would be acquainted with grief. And here's where the air changes. Isaiah says this servant would suffer, not for his own failures, but for the failures of others. That he would be wounded for transgressions not his own, crushed for iniquities he did not commit. Listen carefully. This isn't symbolic language about a nation. It's too specific, too intimate. Isaiah describes silence under accusation. He describes injustice. He describes a death that looks like defeat, but somehow becomes victory. And then, almost casually, Isaiah says something that should never be said unless it's true. He says this servant would die, and yet somehow see life again. Pause. Because this is where history starts to feel like it's holding its breath. Isaiah wrote these words centuries before crucifixion was even invented as a method of execution, centuries before Rome, centuries before crosses lined roads as warnings. Yet Isaiah describes pierced suffering, public humiliation, a death counted among criminals, a burial with the rich, and all of it is written as if Isaiah is watching it happen, not guessing, watching. Now here's the thing. For generations, these words sat quietly in Jewish scripture. They were read, debated, argued, but no one could point to a moment in history where they clearly happened. Not yet. Then, in a small and occupied corner of the Roman world, something unexpected began to unfold. A carpenter from Nazareth started speaking about the kingdom of God, not with political ambition, not with violence, but with authority that unsettled religious leaders and confused the powerful. He healed openly, forgave freely, and warned that everything people trusted, status, power, appearances, was about to be turned upside down. His name was Jesus. And the disturbing thing isn't that people followed him. It's that his life began lining up with Isaiah's words, detail by detail, rejected by his own people, despised by leadership, silent before false accusations. He was beaten, pierced, publicly executed between criminals. And after his death, his body was placed in the tomb of a wealthy man. Isaiah wrote that centuries earlier. But the story doesn't end at the cross, because Isaiah said the servant would see the light of life again. And history records that the tomb didn't stay sealed. Followers claimed resurrection, Enemies couldn't produce a body. Authorities attempted silence and failed. Within decades, the message spread beyond Jerusalem, beyond Judea, across the Roman Empire. And suddenly, Isaiah's prophecy wasn't just a theological debate. It was fueling a movement that refused to die. Here's what makes this even harder to dismiss. The scrolls of Isaiah, containing these exact passages, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, copied centuries before Jesus was born. That means these words weren't edited afterward. They weren't retrofitted. They were already there, waiting. And now the uncomfortable question shifts again. If Isaiah could see empires rise and fall, if he could name Cyrus before his birth, Cyrus the Great, if he could describe exile, return, suffering, and redemption with surgical precision, then what does that say about time itself? Because Isaiah didn't just predict events. He revealed a pattern, a story where history bends toward purpose, where suffering isn't wasted, where power doesn't win by force, where God moves not just through thrones, but through sacrifice. And that brings us to the present, because Isaiah didn't stop with ancient kings or first-century crosses. He spoke of a future restoration, of justice that would reach the ends of the earth, of a day when nations would beat swords into plowshares, a vision where violence doesn't get the final word. And here's the part most people miss. Isaiah frames all of this as invitation, not inevitability, an offer to trust the unseen hand shaping history, or to resist it. And suddenly, the story stops being about Isaiah. It becomes about us, about whether we believe history is random or authored, about whether suffering is meaningless or redemptive, about whether the same God who guided empires is still at work in lives that feel small, forgotten, or overlooked. Listen, if God could write history before it happened, if he could speak through a prophet centuries ahead of time, if he could turn execution into redemption, then what might he be doing in your life right now? Quietly, patiently, long before you see the outcome. This is why Isaiah still matters, not because he predicted history, but because his words suggest that history has never been out of control. And that realization is both comforting and terrifying, because if it's true, then every choice matters, every moment carries weight, and the story is still being written, and the unseen hand has never stopped moving. By the time Isaiah's words reached their final echoes, the world had changed, yet somehow remained the same. Empires still rose with confidence. Leaders still promised peace and delivered chaos. Humanity still searched for meaning and power, wealth and certainty. But beneath the noise of history, something else was happening. Quietly, faithfully. The same unseen hand that shaped the fall of Babylon, that guided a Persian king to release captives, that aligned prophecy with suffering and redemption, was still at work. And here's the truth most people never consider. Isaiah's prophecies don't end with fulfillment. They end with a choice. Because Isaiah didn't just reveal what God would do. He revealed what God invites us into, a world where justice is not forgotten, where suffering is seen, where redemption is not earned, but given. Isaiah spoke of a light to the nations, not confined to one people, not limited by borders or language or time. That light, Christians believe, stepped into history as a man. Jesus Christ didn't arrive as a conqueror. He arrived quietly, vulnerably, with scars instead of armor. And in doing so, he fulfilled not just Isaiah's words, but Isaiah's vision. A God who doesn't rule from distance. A God who enters the story. A God who absorbs pain instead of inflicting it. And that realization should stop us cold. Because if God has been this precise in history, if prophecy, fulfillment, suffering, and restoration align this clearly, then your life is not an accident. Your struggles are not overlooked. Your questions are not ignored. Your pain isn't unseen. The same God who guided kings and empires is present in the quiet moments you think don't matter. The prayers whispered when no one listens. The faith held when answers don't come. The hope that refuses to die. Isaiah's unseen hand is still shaping history. But here's the shocking part. It doesn't force itself. It invites. It asks whether you will trust the author, even when the chapter you're in doesn't make sense yet. Because history, as Isaiah shows us, only makes sense in hindsight. And faith is choosing to believe the story is going somewhere good before you see how it ends. So if you're watching this right now, if something in this story stirred your heart, unsettled your doubts, or reignited your faith, that's not random. That's the same unseen hand, reaching forward through time, inviting you to step into the story. Now bring all of this forward. Because Isaiah's world may feel distant, but his questions live in our headlines. Look around. Nations still rise declaring peace and fall in confusion. Leaders still promise security, yet fear travels faster than truth. Technology connects the world, but loneliness deepens. Information multiplies, but wisdom feels rare. And quietly, beneath the noise of breaking news and endless opinions, the same question Isaiah forced people to confront is still waiting to be answered. Who is really in control? Here's the thing most people don't notice. We live in an age obsessed with prediction. Algorithms try to forecast behavior. Experts model economies. Analysts speculate elections, wars, and outcomes. Yet despite all our data, the world still feels unstable. Isaiah's prophecies don't impress us because they were accurate. They unsettle us because they suggest something deeper. That history doesn't move randomly. That power isn't ultimate. That the loudest voices aren't the ones shaping the final outcome. Isaiah wrote in a time when people trusted alliances, armies, and walls. Today we trust markets, institutions, and systems. Different tools, same illusion. And just like in Isaiah's time, those systems keep failing. Empires collapse not from lack of strength, but from loss of moral foundation. Isaiah warned that when justice collapses, everything else follows. And that warning feels painfully modern. We see injustice debated, truth reframed, right and wrong negotiated. And in the middle of it all, people are tired, spiritually tired, searching for meaning beyond success, looking for hope that isn't dependent on circumstances. That's where Isaiah still speaks, because Isaiah didn't offer escape from the world. He offered a way to see it clearly. He revealed a God who is not threatened by chaos and not absent from suffering, a God who works quietly, patiently, often invisibly, until suddenly history turns. That should change how we look at today. Because if God was working during exile, during oppression, during silence, then He is working now. Even when headlines feel dark, even when faith feels fragile, even when the future feels uncertain, Isaiah reminds us that God's greatest work often happens beneath the surface, long before the breakthrough becomes visible. Think about this. The people living during Isaiah's lifetime didn't see the fulfillment. They trusted anyway. The people in exile didn't feel chosen. They endured anyway. The early believers didn't control the world. They changed it anyway. And now the story has reached us. Not as spectators, but as participants. Because faith in today's world isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the author when the plot feels unresolved. It's about choosing hope when despair is easier. Choosing integrity when compromise is rewarded. Choosing faith when doubt is louder. Isaiah's unseen hand doesn't force belief. It invites trust. And that invitation is still open. So if you're watching this and the world feels unstable, if your faith has felt shaken, if you've wondered whether God is still active or still cares, Isaiah answers without shouting. Yes, God is still writing, still shaping, still redeeming. And just like before, the greatest movements won't begin in palaces or headlines, but in hearts willing to believe that light still overcomes darkness. That's the relevance of Isaiah today. Not ancient prediction, present invitation. And the question he leaves us with is the same one echoing through history. Will we trust the unseen hand or demand control we were never meant to have? Let that question follow you. Because the story isn't finished, and your life, right now, is part of a much larger narrative than you can see. And now, before this story ends, listen closely. Because Isaiah's story was never meant to stop on a page. It was meant to stop in a heart. If you've ever felt small in a world that celebrates power, if you've ever felt unseen while history rushes forward, if you've ever wondered whether your prayers disappear into silence, Isaiah answers you across centuries. You are not forgotten. The same God who guided kings without their permission, who turned exile into restoration, who transformed suffering into salvation, is aware of you, right now. Your tears are not wasted. Your waiting is not meaningless. Your faith, no matter how fragile it feels, is not ignored. History shows us this truth again and again. God does His deepest work quietly, long before anyone realizes something holy is happening. So if today feels confusing, if tomorrow feels uncertain, if your story feels unfinished, that doesn't mean God is absent. It means he's not done yet. And maybe, just maybe, you're standing exactly where generations before you once stood, trusting promises they couldn't yet see fulfilled. This is the learning Isaiah leaves us with. Faith is not seeing the ending. Faith is trusting the author. So as you leave this video, don't rush back into noise. Carry this truth with you. You are part of a story bigger than your fear, bigger than your failure, bigger than this moment. And if this story touched you, if it strengthened your faith even a little, we ask you from the heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Parables of Hope. Your support is not just encouragement, it is fuel. It allows us to keep creating stories that bring light, truth, and faith to people across the world. Watch our previous videos on Parables of Hope. Each one carries wisdom. Each one carries purpose. And each one is meant to remind you that God is still at work. Help us spread this message. Help us let truth win. Help us remind the world that hope is alive. And remember, the unseen hand that shaped history is still shaping you. We need your support, not for numbers, but so this message can reach hearts across the globe. Because when truth spreads, darkness loses ground. And as you go, remember this: history isn't random. Your life isn't forgotten. And the unseen hand that shaped Isaiah's world is still shaping yours. Until next time, walk in faith, hold on to hope, and never forget, the story isn't over yet. Walk forward with faith, hold on to hope.